They found the baby in the root cellar 3 days after she was born, and that was the first impossible thing. The second impossible thing was that she was still alive. The third impossible thing was what she was doing when they found her. It was August in Texas, 1823, and the heat was the kind that made men lose their minds. The kind that turned the Colorado River to a trickle of brown mud and made the air shimmer like water over the cotton fields. The Austin colony was barely 2 years old, carved from wilderness by men who believed they could own land that had never belonged to anyone, worked by people who were never supposed to exist here at all. Because slavery was illegal in Mexico, officially, technically, on paper. But paper burns in the Texas heat, and laws written in Mexico City meant nothing out here in the brutal vastness where Stephen F. Austin's colonists were building their dreams on other people's nightmares. The Meredith plantation sat on a bend in the river, 2,000 acres of cotton and corn, and secrets that went deeper than any well. Thomas Meredith had brought 32 slaves with him from Louisiana, documented as indentured servants, in a fiction that fooled no one and didn't need to. His wife had died on the journey west. His daughter, Josephine, was all he had left. Josephine was 19 when it happened, beautiful in the way that meant dangerous in that time and place. Hair like honey in sunlight, eyes the color of the river when it ran clear, and a mind sharp enough to know that everything she'd been taught about the natural order of the world was a lie built on violence. She fell in love with a man named Samuel. He was 22, brilliant, and property. They were careful. They thought they were careful. But you cannot hide that kind of fire, that kind of defiance. Someone always sees, someone always tells. And when Josephine's belly began to swell despite her increasingly desperate attempts to conceal it, the truth became a weapon that would destroy everyone it touched. Thomas Meredith was a practical man. He had not carved a plantation from wilderness by being sentimental. When he discovered his daughter's condition, when he learned the father was Samuel, the man who worked his fields and dared to love what Meredith considered his most precious possession, he made a decision that he believed would solve everything. He sold Samuel south, sold him to a cotton operation in the Brazos Bottomlands, where men worked until they died and no one asked questions. Sold him before Josephine could say goodbye, before Samuel even knew he was about to become a father. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether this story disturbs you as much as it should. Subscribe to The Sealed Room because history's darkest chapters are the ones they tried to burn. Josephine tried to kill herself twice. The first time, they found her in the river, her dress weighted with stones. The second time, they found her with her father's razor, her wrists already bleeding. Both times, they saved her. Both times, they told her she was being saved. She went silent after that, stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped seeming to be present in her own body. She was 8 months pregnant and fading like a candle burning down to nothing. When the labor came, it came fast and wrong. Josephine was alone in her room, too weak to call for help, too broken to care if she lived or died. She gave birth in silence, biting down on her pillow to muffle the sounds, and when the baby finally came, slick with blood and vernix, Josephine looked at her daughter once. Just once. The baby had Samuel's eyes, dark, knowing, impossibly aware for a newborn, and something else, something that made Josephine's hands shake as she wrapped the infant in her nightgown. The baby was glowing. Not brightly, not like a lantern, but with a soft phosphorescence like certain fungi in the deep woods, like foxfire, like marsh light. Her skin held light the way water holds the moon. Josephine, in her fevered, bleeding, broken state, did the only thing that made sense to her. She took the baby down to the root cellar beneath the house. She laid her in the coolest corner, surrounded by stored potatoes and canned preserves. She whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm sorry," and then she closed the heavy door and went back upstairs to die. She succeeded this time. By morning, Josephine Meredith was gone, and her father was left with a house full of grief and a secret he didn't know he had. They searched for the baby. Of course they searched, but Josephine had told no one where she'd put the child, and in the chaos of grief and funeral preparations, no one thought to check the root cellar. Why would they? A baby couldn't survive down there. No food, no water, no air circulation in the August heat. After 2 days, they stopped searching. They assumed the child had been stillborn, that Josephine had disposed of the body somewhere they'd never find it. They were wrong. It was a slave woman named Ruth who found her. Ruth was 70 if she was a day, bent from decades of labor but still sharp-eyed and suspicious. She'd known Josephine since the girl was born, had loved her in the complicated way that enslaved women loved the children of their enslavers, knowing that those children would grow up to own them, but loving them anyway, because children need love, and Ruth had so much love that bondage couldn't kill it. Ruth went to the root cellar on the 3rd day because she needed potatoes for supper. She opened the heavy door, climbed down the ladder, and stopped. The baby was lying exactly where Josephine had left her, still wrapped in the nightgown. She should have been dead, 3 days without food or water. 3 days in the suffocating heat, 3 days alone in the dark. But she wasn't dead. She wasn't even crying. She was humming. Not the gurgling sounds babies make, not random vocalizations. She was humming a melody, complex and deliberate, a song Ruth had never heard, but that made her bones ache with recognition. And the baby was still glowing, that same soft phosphorescence, brighter now in the darkness of the cellar. But that wasn't the impossible part. The impossible part was the potatoes. Every potato in the cellar had sprouted. Not the weak, pale shoots that potatoes grow when they're stored too long. These were thick, green, vigorous plants, growing impossibly in the darkness, their roots burrowing into the earth floor, their leaves reaching toward the baby like worshippers toward a saint. The baby was feeding from them somehow, drawing sustenance from the plants, or the plants were feeding her, or something was happening that made Ruth's Christian faith and her grandmother's African wisdom both scream that this child was not natural, not right, not possible. Ruth picked up the baby. The humming stopped. The child opened her eyes and looked at Ruth, and Ruth felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening in a room she hadn't known existed. The baby didn't cry. She just watched, those dark, knowing eyes fixed on Ruth's face, and Ruth understood in that moment that this was no ordinary child. This was something else. Something that happened when the world was bent so far out of its natural shape that it broke, and in the breaking created something new. Ruth named her Mercy, not because the child would show mercy, but because the child was mercy, the kind that comes too late to save anyone but arrives anyway, inevitable as morning. She kept the baby hidden for 3 days, nursing her, caring for her, trying to decide what to do. The glow faded when Ruth fed her, as if the child had only been luminous because she was starving for something more than milk. But other things didn't fade. The knowing look in her eyes, the way she never cried but sometimes hummed in that strange, ancient-sounding way. The way plants grew faster when she was near them, reaching toward her like she was the sun. On the 4th day, Ruth brought Mercy to Thomas Meredith. She had to. The baby was white, or mostly white, or white enough that hiding her was impossible, and Ruth, for all her wisdom and strength, was still enslaved. She had no power to protect this child, no ability to make choices about her future. Thomas Meredith looked at his granddaughter and saw the end of everything he'd built. The baby had Josephine's features, refined and perfect. She had Samuel's coloring, that beautiful brown that spoke of African ancestry. She had her mother's hair texture and her father's bone structure, and she was a walking, breathing piece of evidence that his daughter had committed what his world considered the unforgivable sin. He could kill her. It would be easy. A baby that young, in a place this remote. Accidents happened. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, those dark eyes holding an intelligence no infant should possess. Maybe it was guilt over Josephine, over Samuel, over all the choices that had led to this moment. Maybe it was just exhaustion. He made a decision that satisfied no one and protected nothing. Mercy would live, but she would live as property. She would be raised in the quarters, hidden from visitors, never acknowledged. She would work when she was old enough. She would be useful. And when she was old enough to be sold without raising questions, she would disappear from his life forever. Ruth raised her alongside the other children in the quarters, and from the beginning, everyone knew Mercy was different. The plants told them first. Wherever Mercy crawled, wherever her hands touched the ground, things grew. Not slowly, the way plants normally grow, but fast enough to watch. Cotton seeds that fell near her would sprout in hours instead of days. Gardens near Ruth's cabin produced twice what they should. Even the scrubby live oaks seemed to lean toward her, their branches bending in her direction when she passed beneath them. The animals knew too. Dogs would not come near her, horses would shy and snort when she approached, but birds would land on her shoulders completely unafraid. Snakes would sun themselves near her feet. Once, Ruth found her sitting in the grass with a cottonmouth coiled in her lap, its head resting against her chest, both of them perfectly peaceful. The other children avoided her at first, frightened by her strangeness. But Mercy was patient. She would sit at the edge of their games, watching, humming softly to herself. And slowly they began to include her. She was gentle with the younger ones, fierce in protecting those who were bullied. She never spoke until she was 2, and when she finally did, her first words were not "mama" or "papa," but a complete sentence. "The corn will fail this year. Plant sweet potatoes instead." They planted sweet potatoes. The corn failed. The sweet potatoes saved them from starvation. By the time Mercy was 5, people came to her for advice. Quietly, carefully, never where the overseer could see. They asked about crops, about weather, about sickness. She would look at them with those knowing eyes and tell them things she couldn't possibly know. When to harvest, which children would sicken and which would thrive, where to find clean water when the river ran foul. She was always right, always. Thomas Meredith tried to ignore her. He ordered the overseers to keep her away from the big house, away from visitors, away from anywhere she might be seen. But he couldn't ignore what was happening to his plantation. It was failing. Not dramatically, but steadily, inevitably. Fields that should have been productive went barren. Wells that had never run dry went brackish. Equipment broke. Livestock sickened. It was as if the land itself was rejecting him, turning against him, punishing him for something he couldn't name. But the quarters thrived. The small gardens the slaves kept for themselves flourished. The children born there were healthy. The sick recovered faster. And it was all centered on Mercy. This child who should not exist, who was living proof of every broken law and shattered boundary. When Mercy was 7, she told Ruth a secret. "I can see him," she said one night as they sat outside the cabin, watching the stars. "See who, child?" "My father. Not where he is now, but where he was. I can see every moment of his life, like looking through water. And I can see my mother too, everything she felt, everything she wanted. They're both inside me, their memories, their pain. And something else, something that came from the breaking of rules that should never have existed in the first place." Ruth's hands trembled. "That's not possible." Mercy turned to look at her, and in the starlight, her eyes seemed to glow softly, just like they had in the root cellar. "Neither am I," she said, "but here we are." The summer Mercy turned 9, a doctor came to the plantation. His name was Cornelius Webb, and he'd been educated in Philadelphia before returning to Texas to make his fortune, treating colonists for dysentery, fever, and the various infections that flourished in the brutal heat. He'd heard rumors about Meredith's strange slave child, whispers in Brazoria about a girl who knew things she shouldn't, who made plants grow with a touch, who had never been sick a day in her life. Webb was a man of science, a rationalist who believed that every phenomenon had a natural explanation, and he was determined to find it. Thomas Meredith refused him at first. But Webb was persistent and well-connected, and finally, worn down by curiosity and the faint hope that science might explain away what superstition had made monstrous, Meredith agreed to let the doctor examine Mercy. They brought her to the house for the first time since she'd been found in that root cellar. She walked through rooms she'd been conceived in but never allowed to enter, her bare feet silent on floors her mother had walked, past furniture her grandfather had imported from New Orleans, through hallways lined with portraits of people whose blood ran in her veins but who would never claim her. She showed no emotion, just walked, quiet and watchful, to the study where Webb had set up his instruments. He was gentle at first. He measured her pulse, her temperature, her reflexes. All normal. He tested her vision, her hearing, her sense of touch. All unremarkable. He drew blood, examined it under his microscope, found nothing unusual in its composition. But then he asked her questions. "Can you read, child?" "Yes." Webb glanced at Meredith, surprised. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Texas, as it had been in Louisiana. But Meredith just shrugged, too tired to care anymore. "How did you learn?" "I watched. I remembered. Reading is just patterns. Everything is patterns." Webb pulled out a medical text, opened it to a random page, and handed it to her. It was a dense description of circulatory anatomy, written in technical language. Mercy read it aloud, perfectly, not stumbling over a single Latin term. Then she looked up at Webb and said, "You have a blockage in your left anterior descending artery, small but growing. You feel chest pain sometimes when you climb stairs. You tell yourself it's indigestion." Webb's face went pale. "How could you possibly—" "I can hear it. Your heart sounds different than other people's hearts, like water flowing through a pipe that's narrowing. You should eat less meat, more vegetables. And you should stop smoking tobacco. It's making it worse." The doctor sat down heavily, his scientific certainty crumbling. "What are you?" Mercy tilted her head, considering the question. "My mother was a white woman who loved a black man in a world that said love like that was impossible. My father was an enslaved man who loved a white woman in a world that would kill him for it. I am what happens when impossible things happen anyway. I am the question with no answer. I am the proof that your laws don't govern nature, only people." "That's not a scientific explanation. Science doesn't have words for what I am yet. Maybe it never will. Some things exist outside your ability to measure them." Webb tried for 3 more days. He brought more instruments, more tests, more questions. He measured electromagnetic fields around her body and found fluctuations he couldn't explain. He tested her knowledge and found she knew things no child should know, could predict events with disturbing accuracy, could diagnose illness in people she'd never met just by looking at them. On the 4th day, he asked the question that had been haunting him. "Can you see the future?" "I can see possibilities." "The future isn't fixed. It's like water finding its way downhill. There are many paths, but some are more likely than others. And some things are inevitable, like water reaching the ocean eventually. Like your death, Dr. Webb. You have 3 years, maybe 4, if you change your habits. And your grandfather, can you see his future?" Mercy turned to look at Thomas Meredith, who had been sitting silently in the corner, watching these examinations with growing dread. "Yes. Tell me." "He'll die in his sleep 18 months from now, peacefully, which is more mercy than he deserves. But before he dies, he'll try to sell me. He'll fail, and everything he's built will turn to dust, because you can't build anything lasting on stolen lives and broken loves. The land knows. The land remembers, and the land always collects what's owed." Meredith stood up, his face flushed with anger and fear. "Get out, both of you. This examination is over." Webb gathered his instruments and left, but not before taking Mercy aside and whispering, "If you ever need help, if you're ever in danger, find me. I don't understand what you are, but I know you don't deserve to be property." Mercy smiled, small and sad. "No one does, Dr. Webb. That's the whole point." After Webb left, things began to accelerate. Meredith, frightened by Mercy's prediction and desperate to prove her wrong, tried to sell her. He contacted traders, brought potential buyers to examine her, offered her at prices far below market value. But every deal fell through. Buyers would come, look at Mercy, and suddenly find excuses to leave. One man rode out specifically to purchase her, took one look at her face, and rode away without speaking a word. Another agreed to the sale, shook hands on it, then fell from his horse on the way home and broke his neck. After the third failed sale, no one would come anymore. Word spread that the Meredith girl was cursed, that buying her was inviting disaster. And Meredith, trapped with this child who was the living embodiment of his failures, began to drink heavily and withdraw from the world. Mercy, meanwhile, was growing into something more than a child, more than human. She was 11 when her powers truly manifested in ways that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. It started with the drought. The summer of 1834 was the hottest anyone could remember. The Colorado River shrank to scattered pools, cotton withered in the fields, corn died before it could tassel. People began to talk about abandoning the colony, returning to Louisiana or moving further north where the land might be more forgiving. But the quarters had water. A spring that had always been weak and intermittent suddenly began to flow strong and clear right next to Ruth's cabin, right where Mercy spent most of her time. The other colonists noticed. They came begging for water, and Meredith, in a rare moment of practical mercy, allowed it. Lines formed at the spring, white families humbling themselves to drink from a source on slave ground, and every one of them saw Mercy sitting near the water, her hands in the dirt, humming that strange, wordless song. One woman, a recent immigrant from Tennessee named Sarah Pritchard, approached Mercy directly. "Are you doing this, making the water flow?" Mercy looked up at her. The water was always there, it just needed permission to rise. Permission from who? From what's underneath, from what was here before any of us. The land has a will, Mrs. Pritchard. Most people never learn to hear it. I hear it all the time. Sarah knelt down, brought her face close to Mercy's. "Can you make it rain?" "No, I can't control weather. I can only listen to what the land needs and help it get what it's asking for. Rain will come when the patterns shift. 3 more weeks. How do you know? The same way you know when your child is about to cry. You feel it before it happens." Sarah stood, filled her bucket, and walked away. But she thought about that conversation for years afterward, about the strange child who spoke like an elder, who seemed to carry some ancient knowledge that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with connection to something deeper than human understanding. 3 weeks later, it rained. Not a gentle rain, but a deluge that lasted 3 days and broke the drought completely. Mercy's reputation grew. People came to her with questions, with problems, with sick children and failing crops, and she helped them. She told them what to plant and when. She diagnosed illnesses. She predicted storms and droughts. She became an oracle, a resource, a thing that people used while simultaneously fearing and resenting her. Because she was still enslaved, still property, still legally nothing. And that contradiction, that fundamental wrongness, was about to tear the plantation apart. The overseer's name was Marcus Calloway, and he was everything brutal about the system distilled into one man. He'd been hired after the previous overseer had quit, claiming the plantation was cursed and he wouldn't stay another day. Calloway didn't believe in curses. He believed in control, in punishment, in maintaining order through fear. He saw Mercy as a threat to that order. Saw how the other slaves looked at her, how they listened to her, how her mere existence challenged the hierarchy he was paid to enforce. And he decided to break her, publicly and completely, to remind everyone of their place. It happened on a Wednesday morning in September. Mercy was in the fields, working despite being only 12, because Calloway had decided she'd been coddled long enough. She was pulling weeds when Calloway approached, his whip coiled in his hand. "You, come here." Mercy straightened, looked at him calmly. "Why?" "Because I said so. That's not a reason. That's just power pretending to be reason." Calloway's face flushed red. He grabbed her arm, hard enough to bruise. "You'll learn to respect authority." I'll respect wisdom, I'll respect kindness, I'll respect strength used to protect rather than harm. But I won't respect you, Mr. Calloway, because you're empty. You're just violence in a man's shape." He raised the whip. The field went silent. Every worker stopped, watching, waiting. Calloway brought the whip down. It never touched her. 3 feet from Mercy's back, the whip stopped in midair as if it had hit an invisible wall. Calloway pulled, yanked, threw his whole weight into it. The whip wouldn't move. It was frozen in space, held by nothing anyone could see. And then it began to smoke. The leather, blackened, charred, turned to ash that drifted away on the breeze. The handle in Calloway's hand grew hot, then burning hot. He dropped it with a scream, staring at his blistered palm. Mercy turned to face him. Her eyes were glowing softly, that same phosphorescence from the root cellar, that light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. "You can't touch me," she said quietly. "You never could. None of you can. I am protected by something older than your laws, stronger than your violence, more permanent than your plantation. I am protected by the simple fact that I should not exist, and yet I do. And existence always wins over the forces that try to deny it." Calloway stumbled backward, his burned hand clutched to his chest. "You're a demon. You're unnatural." "No, Mr. Calloway. I'm a mirror, and what you see in me is what you've made. You created me. Your system created me. Every law you broke to keep human beings as property, every love you forbade, every family you destroyed, all of that created the conditions for me to exist. I am your consequence. I am what happens when you bend the world so far out of shape that something has to break through." Calloway ran. Actually ran, across the field, back to the house, babbling about demons and witchcraft. The slaves stood frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, they began to smile. Ruth came to Mercy that night, her face troubled. "Child, what you did today, it's going to bring trouble. White folks don't forgive that kind of defiance. They can't afford to." "I know." "Then why did you do it?" Mercy looked at her with ancient eyes. "Because it's time. I've been patient. I've been quiet. I've let them pretend I'm not here, not real, not important. But I am all those things, and they need to start reckoning with that. With me, with what they've done, because the reckoning is coming whether they're ready for it or not." "What reckoning?" "The one where the debts come due, where the stolen comes home, where the denied stands up and demands to be seen. My father is still alive, Ruth. He's on a plantation 200 miles south of here, working land that should have killed him years ago but hasn't because something in him won't die. Because he made a child, and some part of him knows it, feels it, and that connection keeps him breathing. I'm going to find him, and when I do, we're going to end this. Not just our enslavement, all of it, the whole rotten system." Ruth's eyes widened. "Child, that's impossible." "So am I," Mercy said. "And yet here we are." The next morning, Thomas Meredith was found dead in his bed. Peaceful, just as Mercy had predicted, his face calm, as if he'd simply decided to stop fighting and let go. He'd lived exactly 18 months from the day Mercy had told Webb about his death. The plantation was in chaos. Meredith had no other heirs. The property, including the land and the people on it, would go to distant cousins in Louisiana. In the confusion of transition, in the weeks of legal proceedings and estate settlements, in that space between owners when no one was quite in charge and everyone was uncertain, Mercy did the impossible thing. She walked away. Not ran. Walked. In broad daylight, down the road, with a small bag of belongings and absolute confidence in her stride. They tried to stop her. Calloway, his hand still bandaged, rode after her. "You can't leave. Your property." Mercy stopped, turned to face him. "No, Mr. Calloway. I'm prophecy. I'm consequence. I'm the future coming to collect from the past. And you can't stop the future any more than you can stop the sun from rising. I'll shoot you where you stand. Try. He drew his pistol, aimed at her chest, pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. He pulled the trigger again. Again. The gun wouldn't fire, and as Calloway stared at the weapon in disbelief, vines began to grow from the ground around his horse's hooves. Fast, impossible fast, wrapping around the animal's legs, climbing up Calloway's legs, pulling him down from the saddle. He fell hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. By the time he could breathe again, Mercy was gone, disappeared into the Texas wilderness like smoke into wind. And behind her, the plantation began to die in earnest. The buildings aged overnight, the fields went barren, the machinery rusted. It was as if whatever life force had been sustaining it through Mercy's presence had left with her, and without that force, the whole enterprise simply gave up the ghost. Within a year, the Meredith plantation was abandoned. Within 5 years, it was ruins. And the people who'd been held there scattered to the winds, free not because of any law or liberation, but because the system that had imprisoned them simply collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Mercy, meanwhile, walked south, toward her father, toward destiny, toward a reckoning that would reshape Texas forever. She was 13 years old, glowing softly in the darkness, humming a song that sounded like justice, and the land opened paths before her like a queen returning home. The journey south should have killed her. 13 years old, alone, traveling through territory where Comanche raids were common, where Mexican soldiers patrolled uneasily, where Anglo-colonists viewed any unaccompanied person of color as either property to be claimed or threat to be eliminated. She had no weapons, no money, no protection except whatever it was that lived inside her, that made plants grow and guns misfire, and men see things in her eyes that made them turn away. It was enough. She walked through country that was still more wilderness than civilization, following the Colorado River south and west, then cutting overland toward the Brazos Bottomlands, where her father had been sold 13 years before. She walked 20 miles a day, her feet hardening, her body lean and strong, her mind focused on a single point in space and time, where she would finally meet the man whose blood ran in her veins and whose memories somehow lived in her mind. Because that was the truth she'd never told anyone, not even Ruth. She carried Samuel inside her, not just genetically but actually. She could access his memories like opening a book. She knew the feel of cotton bolls in his hands, the taste of cornmeal mush he'd eaten as a child, the sound of his mother's voice singing him to sleep. She knew the first time he'd seen Josephine, the way his heart had stopped and started again in a new rhythm. She knew the exact moment he'd realized he loved her, and the exact moment he'd understood that love would cost him everything. She also knew where he was, could feel him like a compass needle feels north, could sense the direction of him, even when she slept, dreaming of the connection that pulled her forward. The first night, she slept in a grove of live oaks and woke to find deer grazing around her, completely unafraid. One doe came close enough to sniff her hair, its wet nose gentle against her cheek. The second night, she found a settler's cabin. The family inside was sick, 2 children burning with fever, their mother frantic with worry. Mercy knocked on the door and offered to help. The woman, seeing a young girl alone, tried to turn her away. But Mercy said, "Your son has pneumonia. Your daughter has scarlet fever. If you don't treat them differently, your daughter will die by morning." The woman stared. "How could you possibly? Let me help. I can't cure them, but I can tell you what will work and what won't." Desperate, the woman let her in. Mercy examined both children, her hands hovering over their feverish bodies, her eyes distant as if she were seeing something beyond the physical. Then she told the mother exactly what to do. Different herbs for each child, prepared in specific ways, administered at specific times. The mother followed the instructions. By morning, both children's fevers had broken. By evening, they were sitting up, eating, arguing with each other the way healthy siblings do. The father, a stoic German immigrant named Hans Weiss, tried to pay Mercy. She refused. "I don't want money. I want information. I'm looking for a plantation on the Brazos. Big cotton operation, brutal. They break men there. Hans's face darkened. I know the place you mean. 30 miles south. The Kinsley plantation. No one goes there by choice. Men who work that land don't come back. My father is there. Then your father is dead, child, or wishes he was. He's not dead. I'd know if he was dead. I can feel him breathing. Hans studied her face for a long moment. You're not natural, are you? My children should be dead, but you saved them with knowledge no girl your age should have. What are you? I'm someone looking for her father. That's all you need to know. Hans gave her food, a blanket, a knife for protection. His wife gave her a dress that didn't mark her as a runaway slave. And they pointed her south, toward the Brazos, toward hell, toward Samuel. She walked through country that got progressively darker, not physically darker, but spiritually darker, as if the land itself was poisoned by what happened on it. She passed small plantations where she could hear the crack of whips, the sounds of suffering that no one bothered to hide, because who was there to hide it from? She passed through towns where slave markets operated openly despite Mexican law, where men were bought and sold like cattle, where families were torn apart on auction blocks, while buyers discussed them with the same tone they'd use to evaluate livestock. And everywhere she went, she changed things. She couldn't help it. Her presence altered the land around her. Wells that had been brackish ran clear when she passed. Gardens that had been failing suddenly flourished. Animals that had been sick recovered. It was as if she radiated health, vitality, life itself, and it spilled out of her in ways she couldn't control. But there was a darker side too. Men who saw her and thought cruel thoughts would find their horses going lame. Overseers who raised whips in her presence would find their arms suddenly paralyzed. Slave catchers who rode past her would lose their way, wandering in circles until their supplies ran out and they had to turn back. She was becoming a legend. Stories spread faster than she could walk. Tales of a girl who glowed in the dark, who could kill with a look, who could make the land obey her will. Some said she was an angel. Some said she was a demon. Most didn't know what to call her, but knew enough to get out of her way. She reached the Brazos River on the 9th day of walking. The water ran dark and slow, heavy with silt, nothing like the clear Colorado she'd known. The air smelled of rot and cotton and human despair. This was the heart of slavery in Texas, where the fiction of indentured servitude didn't even pretend to exist, where Mexican law was a joke and human beings were commodities measured by their capacity to produce profit. The Kinsley plantation stretched for 3,000 acres along the river. Cotton as far as the eye could see, worked by 200 enslaved people who lived in conditions that made the Meredith plantation look merciful by comparison. Mercy stood at the edge of the property and felt her father's presence like a physical pull. He was here. After 13 years of separation, 13 years of his not knowing she existed, they were finally in the same place. She walked onto the plantation at dusk, not hiding, not sneaking, just walking. The field workers saw her and stopped, their faces confused. A young girl, alone, walking with purpose toward the quarters, as if she had every right to be there. The overseer, a man named Pike, who was famous for his cruelty even in a region that celebrated cruelty, rode out to intercept her. "Girl, you lost?" "No." "You got papers? Permission to be here?" "I don't need permission to find my father." Pike laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. "Your father? Girlie, if your daddy's on this plantation, he ain't in any condition to care for you. Best turn around and go back where you came from." Mercy looked up at him, and Pike felt something cold slide down his spine. Her eyes were wrong, too knowing, too old, too full of something that made him want to run. "My father's name is Samuel. He was sold here from the Meredith plantation 13 years ago. Take me to him." "I don't take orders from—" The horse reared. Pike grabbed for the reins, but the animal was panicking, eyes rolling white, foam flying from its mouth. It bucked, hard, and Pike flew from the saddle, landing heavily in the dirt. By the time he scrambled to his feet, Mercy was already walking past him, heading toward the quarters, and every enslaved person in the field was watching with expressions that ranged from shock to something that might have been hope. She found Samuel in the third cabin she tried. He was sitting on a pallet, his back against the wall, his body worn down by 13 years of brutal labor. He was 35 but looked 50, his hands gnarled, his back scarred, his eyes tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment they just stared at each other. He saw a girl, maybe 13, with features that made his heart stop because they were Josephine's features. The same bone structure, the same mouth, the same way of holding her head. But the eyes were his, dark and deep and knowing. She saw the man whose memories she'd carried her whole life, whose pain had echoed through her dreams, whose love for her mother had created her against all odds. "Samuel," she said softly. His breath caught. "How do you know my name?" "I'm Mercy. I'm your daughter." The cabin went silent. The other men who shared the space stared, not understanding how this could be possible, how this girl could exist. Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "Josephine, she died the night I was born, but not before she named me and hid me where they wouldn't find me. I survived, and I've come to take you home." "There is no home, child. There's only this. There's only suffering until we die." Mercy shook her head. "That's what they want you to believe, but it's not true. You're going to walk out of here, Samuel. You're going to be free, and you're going to help me end this." One of the other men, an older slave named Marcus, laughed bitterly. "Child, you don't understand how this works. We can't just leave. They'll hunt us. They'll catch us. They'll make examples of us." "They'll try," Mercy said, "but they'll fail. Because I'm not like other people. I'm not bound by the rules that bind you. And when I break those rules, they stay broken." "What are you?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm what happens when love refuses to die. I'm what happens when injustice creates pressure until something has to break through. I'm your daughter, Samuel, and I'm also something more. Something this world made by accident when it tried to keep people apart who were meant to be together." She reached out and took his hand. The moment they touched, Samuel gasped. He could feel it, the connection, the shared blood, the memories flowing between them. He saw flashes of her life, her childhood, her powers, and she saw deeper into his memories, felt his love for Josephine, his grief at being torn away from her, his determination to survive even when survival seemed pointless. "They told me she died in childbirth," he whispered. "They said the baby died too. They lied. I lived, and I've been looking for you since I was old enough to understand what looking meant." Samuel stood on shaking legs. "If what you say is true, if you can really do what you claim, then show me. Prove it." Mercy smiled. "Look outside." They went to the door of the cabin. The sun had just set, and the sky was deep purple edging to black, but the cotton fields were glowing. Every plant, every bowl, every leaf was emanating soft light, the same phosphorescence that had marked Mercy since birth. The entire plantation was lit up like daylight, but a daylight that came from the earth itself, from the plants, from the land that had been soaked in blood and tears and had finally found a way to push back. People were emerging from cabins, from the fields, from the big house, all staring at the impossible sight. And in that moment of wonder and confusion, Mercy raised her voice. "My name is Mercy. I am the daughter of Samuel and Josephine, born of a love that was forbidden, raised on land that was stolen, made powerful by a system that tried to deny my existence. I am here to offer you a choice. You can stay in bondage, or you can walk away. Tonight, right now. And I promise you, anyone who tries to stop you will fail." Pike came running, his face red with rage. "You think you can just steal my workers? You think you can just walk in here and destroy property?" "They're not property," Mercy said quietly. "They never were. That's the lie you tell yourselves to justify the cruelty. But lies don't change truth. They just pile up until the weight of them crushes you." Pike raised his rifle. "I'll shoot you where you stand." "No," Mercy said, "you won't." She was right. Pike pulled the trigger, and the gun exploded in his hands. Not misfired, exploded. The barrel split like a flower opening, the stock shattered, and Pike fell back screaming, his hands torn and bleeding. The other overseers, watching from a distance, didn't approach. They'd seen enough. They were cruel men, but they weren't stupid. Something was happening here that was beyond their ability to control, and survival meant knowing when to back away. Mercy turned to the assembled slaves. Nearly 200 people, ranging from children to elders, all staring at her with expressions of disbelief and desperate hope. "If you want to leave, walk south to the river. There's a crossing half a mile downstream. On the other side is Mexican territory, true Mexican territory, where slavery actually is illegal and the law is enforced. I've already been there. I've already spoken to the commanders of the garrison. They're expecting you. They'll protect you, and if anyone tries to follow, I'll know, and I'll stop them." "How?" someone called out. "How can you promise that?" "Because the land listens to me, and the land is tired of what's been done on it. The land wants justice too. So go, take your children, take your elders, walk away from this place, and don't look back." For a moment, no one moved. It was too big, too impossible, too dangerous. And then Samuel stepped forward, stood beside his daughter and said, "I'm going. I've been dead for 13 years. Might as well see what living feels like." That broke the spell. People began to move, gathering their few possessions, taking children by the hand, helping the elderly. A slow stream at first, then a river, nearly 200 people walking away from bondage, away from the Kinsley plantation, towards something they'd never dared to hope for. Freedom. They walked through fields that glowed with impossible light, past overseers who'd been struck paralyzed by fear or shock, past the big house where Kinsley himself watched from a window, his face white, his hands shaking, unable to comprehend what was happening. Mercy and Samuel walked at the rear, making sure everyone made it safely. And as they walked, Mercy felt something shift inside her. A tightness she'd carried her whole life was loosening. She'd found her father. She'd saved these people. She'd done something that mattered. But she also knew it wasn't enough. This was one plantation. There were dozens more, hundreds across Texas, thousands across the South. The system was vast, entrenched, defended by law and custom and violence. One girl, no matter how powerful, couldn't end it all. But she could start something. She could plant a seed that would grow into something larger than herself. She could show people that the impossible was possible, that bondage could be broken, that the future didn't have to look like the past. They reached the river crossing just before midnight. The Mexican soldiers were there, as promised, with torches and supplies. The refugees waded across, helped by the soldiers, and on the other side, they collapsed, weeping, laughing, unable to believe they were actually free. Samuel stood on the southern bank, his feet in Mexican mud, his daughter beside him, and for the first time in 13 years, he smiled. "We did it," he whispered. "We started it," Mercy corrected, "but there's more to do, so much more." Behind them, on the north bank, Pike stood with a dozen armed men, watching. They had rifles, they had horses, they had every advantage. But they didn't cross. Something held them back. Maybe it was the Mexican soldiers. Maybe it was fear of starting a diplomatic incident. Or maybe it was the girl standing on the far shore, glowing softly in the darkness, her eyes fixed on them with an expression that promised terrible things if they took one step into that water. They turned back, and Mercy knew they'd spread the story. The story of the girl who walked into a plantation and walked out with 200 freed slaves. The story of a power that could make guns explode and land obey, and impossible things happen. The legend was growing. And legends have a way of changing the world, even when the world doesn't want to change. News traveled like fire through dry grass. Within a week, every plantation in Texas had heard about the Kinsley exodus. Within a month, the story had reached Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri. The details changed with each telling. Some said Mercy had killed a dozen overseers. Some said she'd made the earth swallow the plantation whole. Some said she was 7 feet tall, or could fly, or could turn men to stone with a glance. The truth was stranger than any of the exaggerations. A 13-year-old girl had walked into one of the most brutal plantations in Texas and walked out with 200 freed slaves, and no one had been able to stop her. The Anglo-colonists panicked. If slaves believed they could simply walk away, if they believed some mystical protector would shield them from consequences, the entire system would collapse. Emergency meetings were held, militias were formed, bounties were posted, not just for Mercy, but for anyone who'd escaped with her. Mexico, seeing an opportunity to weaken the Anglo colonies and assert its authority, declared that any enslaved person who reached Mexican territory would be granted immediate freedom and protection. It was a political move, a way to punish the colonists who were constantly agitating for independence, but it was also a lifeline, a door that had been opened and couldn't be closed. And Mercy became a legend overnight, the girl who glowed, the girl who couldn't be stopped, the girl who was proof that the system could be defied. Samuel watched his daughter in the weeks after the crossing and saw her changing, not physically, but in some deeper way. The power inside her was growing, becoming harder to control. Sometimes when she touched things, they would wither or bloom unpredictably. Sometimes her eyes glowed even in daylight. Sometimes she would stand perfectly still for hours, her consciousness somewhere else, listening to things no one else could hear. "Something's wrong," he told Ruth, who'd made the crossing with them and had appointed herself Mercy's protector and advisor. "She's burning up," Ruth said quietly. "That power inside her, it's like a fire. It's consuming her. She's too young, too small to carry what she's carrying. How long does she have?" Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. Months, maybe. A year if we're lucky. But she knows. She's always known. That's why she's in such a hurry. That's why she can't rest." Because Mercy wasn't resting. The Kinsley liberation had been just the beginning. She was organizing now, creating networks, spreading information. She'd learned that her father wasn't the only one who'd been sold south, that there were hundreds, maybe thousands of enslaved people in Texas who could be freed if they knew where to go and how to get there. She created what would later be called the Luminous Road, though she never named it herself. It was an underground network of safe houses, guides, and routes that led from plantations across Texas to the Mexican border. And Mercy walked it constantly, back and forth, north and south, helping people escape, teaching others how to help, spreading knowledge and hope and defiance. She was tireless, exhausting, impossible to keep up with. She would walk 40 miles in a day, sleep for 3 hours, and walk 40 more. She would free a dozen people here, 2 dozen there, never staying in one place long enough to be caught, always moving, always working. The price she paid was visible. By the time she was 14, she looked ancient. Her hair had gone silver white. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, as if you could see light moving underneath it. Her eyes glowed constantly now, no longer just in darkness but all the time, that soft phosphorescence that marked her as something other than human. She was dying, and everyone could see it. The power that had saved so many was consuming her from within, burning through her body like a candle flame consuming wax. Samuel begged her to stop, to rest, to let others carry the burden. But Mercy wouldn't listen. "I was made for this," she told him. "Born of impossible love, kept alive by impossible circumstances, given impossible powers. I'm not meant to live a normal life, Father. I'm meant to burn bright and change things and fade away. That's the trade, and I accepted it the moment I understood what I was. You're my daughter. You're supposed to outlive me. I'm everyone's daughter. Every person trapped in bondage, I'm theirs too. And I'd rather live 1 year doing this than 50 years pretending I'm normal when I'm not." By the spring of 1836, Mercy had helped free over 800 people. 800 souls who'd crossed into Mexico, who'd been given papers and protection, who'd started new lives in freedom. It was a fraction of the enslaved population in Texas, but it was something. It was proof that the system had cracks, that resistance was possible, that the future didn't have to be a straight line extending from the past. But the Texas Revolution was coming. The Anglo colonists were about to declare independence from Mexico, were about to go to war to create their own nation, and one of their primary motivations was to establish slavery permanently and irrevocably, free from Mexican interference. Mercy saw it coming, could feel it in the land, in the patterns of violence and greed and fear that were converging toward inevitable conflict, and she knew what it meant. If Texas became independent, if the colonists won, everything she'd done would be undone. Mexico would no longer be a refuge, the luminous road would be closed. The people she'd freed would be hunted and possibly re-enslaved. She made a decision that would define her legacy. In February of 1836, she walked into San Antonio de Bexar, into the Mexican garrison, and asked to speak to General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna himself. She was 15 years old, looked 70, and glowed with a light that made soldiers cross themselves and whisper prayers. Remarkably, Santa Anna agreed to see her. Perhaps he was curious, perhaps he'd heard the stories, perhaps he sensed that this strange girl represented something important. They met in a room overlooking the town plaza. Santa Anna was a complicated man, a general who'd fought for Mexican independence, a politician who'd served as president multiple times, a leader whose legacy would be debated for centuries. He looked at Mercy with sharp, calculating eyes. They say you can work miracles. They say many things, most are exaggerations. But some are true? Some are true. I can help enslaved people reach freedom. I can make the land cooperate with me in ways others can't. I can see patterns that most people miss. And I can predict that if you don't act decisively, you'll lose Texas. Santa Anna leaned forward. Explain. The colonists are going to rebel. You know this already. They're gathering forces, stockpiling weapons, preparing for war. And they're going to fight harder than you expect, because they're not just fighting for land or autonomy. They're fighting for the right to own human beings. That's what this is really about. Everything else is justification, but slavery is the core. And people will commit incredible atrocities to preserve their right to commit atrocities. You want me to prevent the rebellion? I want you to make abolition non-negotiable. Make it clear that any Texas, independent or not, will be a Texas without slavery. Make it clear that Mexico will never compromise on this point. Some of the colonists will still fight, but others might not. Others might decide that land without slaves isn't worth dying for. And even if they all fight and you lose, you'll have established a principle. You'll have said clearly that this was a war about slavery, not about freedom. And history will remember that. Santa Anna studied her for a long moment. And if I do this, what do you offer in return? Information. I can tell you where the rebel forces are gathering, what their plans are, how they're supplied. I can help you win this war if it comes. But more than that, I can help you build a Mexico where people like me don't need to exist, where the contradictions and cruelties that created me don't create others, where freedom is real, not just a word on paper. They talked for hours. Mercy shared everything she knew, every detail she'd gathered in her travels, every secret she'd learned. She told him about the garrison at Bexar, about the men gathering at Gonzales, about the supply lines and communication networks. She also told him about the Alamo, the old mission where rebel forces were gathering, and what would happen if he tried to take it by force. You'll win, she said quietly, but the cost will be high. And the story that gets told afterward will make you a villain and them heroes. Even though they're fighting to preserve slavery and you're fighting to end it, the story will flip. That's how power works. The victors write history, and even when they're the victors of only the narrative, not the actual war, they still get to control what people believe. Then why fight at all? Because doing right isn't about how the story gets told. It's about what you do when no one's watching, or when everyone's watching and judging you harshly, and you do it anyway because it's right. You're going to lose Texas, General. But you can lose it standing for something, or you can lose it standing for nothing. The choice is yours. Santa Anna made his choice. On the 24th of February 1836, he issued a declaration that any enslaved person who reached Mexican lines would be immediately freed and armed if they chose to fight for Mexico. It was a practical decision, a way to weaken his enemies. But it was also a moral one, a clear statement about what the war was really about. The declaration spread quickly. Enslaved people across Texas began to escape, heading toward Mexican forces, seeking freedom. The luminous road became a flood, and Mercy walked it one last time, helping as many as she could, knowing that her time was running out. She was at the Alamo when the siege began, not inside the mission but outside, helping refugees escape the coming battle. She could feel the violence building, could sense the hundreds of lives about to be extinguished in a fight that would be misremembered for centuries. On the night of March 5th, she found her father among the refugees. Samuel was guiding a group of newly freed families south, his face weathered but his eyes clear. He'd found purpose in the work, in helping others escape the bondage he'd known. "You should come with us," he said, looking at his daughter's translucent skin, her silver hair, her glowing eyes. "You've done enough. Rest now." "I can't. There are still people inside, people who need to know they have a choice." "Mercy, you're dying. Everyone can see it. You've given everything. You don't owe anyone more than what you've already given." She smiled, and in that smile Samuel saw the baby she'd been, the child who shouldn't have survived but did, the girl who'd walked into his life and changed everything. "I owe myself," she said softly. "I owe the person I was born to be. The one who doesn't walk away when things are hard. The one who burns bright even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." She kissed his cheek, her lips cold as winter, and walked away. Toward the mission, toward the siege, toward whatever final act she had left in her. Samuel never saw her again. What happened next became a story told in fragments, pieced together from dozens of sources over decades. Mexican soldiers reported seeing a girl glowing in the darkness, walking through their lines untouched. Texian defenders spoke of a figure appearing on the walls, offering them safe passage if they'd lay down their weapons. Enslaved people who'd been trapped inside the Alamo spoke of a voice in the night, telling them where to go, how to escape, promising protection. When the final assault came on March 6th, when the walls were breached and the killing began, 12 enslaved people walked out alive. They walked through fire and chaos and violence, untouched, as if something invisible shielded them. They said a girl with glowing eyes had guided them, had told them exactly when to move, exactly where to go. And after the battle, after the mission fell and the bodies were counted, there was one body they couldn't identify. A girl, young, with silver hair and translucent skin. She'd been found in the chapel, peaceful, as if she'd simply laid down and decided to stop. Her eyes were closed, but witnesses said that for hours after they found her, her body continued to glow softly, fading gradually like a sunset, until finally the light went out, and she was just a girl. Just a body, just another casualty in a war about slavery that history would insist was about freedom. Samuel heard about her death 3 days later. He wept, but not with surprise. He'd known, the moment she'd walked away from him, that she wasn't coming back. They buried her near San Antonio, in a spot she'd chosen months before, under a live oak that would grow massive over the following decades. There was no marker at first, no stone to identify her. Just a grave that glowed faintly on certain nights, soft enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking, bright enough that those who needed to find it always could. But Samuel made sure her story was told. He spent the rest of his life documenting what had happened, interviewing the people she'd saved, recording the details of the luminous road and how it had operated. He wrote it all down in careful script, knowing that history had a way of forgetting the uncomfortable parts, the parts that challenged the accepted narrative. He wrote about his daughter, born of impossible love, kept alive by impossible circumstances, given impossible powers. He wrote about how she'd used those powers, not for revenge or destruction, but for liberation. How she'd burned bright and brief and changed the world in the short time she'd been given. The Texas Republic won its independence. Slavery became legal, protected by law, more entrenched than ever. The people Mercy had freed were hunted, and some were recaptured. The luminous road was shut down. Mexico's northern border became a wall instead of a door. But the story survived, passed down in whispers and songs, in memories and journals, in the testimony of those who'd known her or been saved by her. The story of the girl science couldn't explain, who'd been born to a slave and a planter's daughter, who'd walked through fire and freed hundreds, who'd shown that even the most entrenched system could be challenged by one person willing to burn bright enough. Samuel lived to see the Civil War. He was 73 when news came that slavery had finally been abolished throughout the United States. He walked back to that grave under the live oak, now barely visible, overgrown with wild flowers that seemed to grow nowhere else, and he spoke to the daughter he'd known for such a brief time. "We did it," he said, "not the way you wanted, not as fast as you wanted, but we did it, and you started it. You showed everyone it was possible." The grave glowed softly that night, one last time, as if acknowledging him, as if saying that the work was never truly finished, that every generation had to choose between comfort and conscience, between looking away and bearing witness. Samuel died 3 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep, and they buried him next to his daughter. 2 graves under one tree, marked now with simple stones that gave only names and dates, no indication of the impossible story that connected them. The tree grew massive over the decades. People began calling it the Mercy Oak, though most had forgotten why. They'd picnic in its shade, children would climb its branches, lovers would carve their initials into its bark. And sometimes, on certain nights, witnesses would report a soft glow beneath the tree, and a sound like humming, and a feeling that made them think about justice and sacrifice and the price of freedom. Historians would later debate whether Mercy had really existed. Some claimed she was a myth, a story created to give hope to the enslaved, a legend that grew in the telling until it bore no resemblance to reality. Others pointed to the documented exodus from Kinsley Plantation, to Samuel's detailed journals, to the testimony of dozens of people who claimed to have met her. But the debate missed the point. Whether Mercy had been exactly as the stories described, or something more mundane, didn't matter. What mattered was that the story existed, that it was told and retold, that it reminded people that systems of oppression were not inevitable or permanent, that they could be challenged and sometimes broken. What mattered was that 800 people had walked to freedom when freedom seemed impossible. That they'd done it because one girl had refused to accept that the world as it was had to be the world as it would always be. In the 1,920 seconds, a historian from Houston tracked down the last living person who claimed to have met Mercy. She was a woman named Sarah, 106 years old, who'd been 4 when she made the crossing from Kinsley Plantation. "What do you remember about her?" the historian asked. Sarah thought for a long moment, her ancient eyes distant. "I remember her eyes, so sad, like she knew everything that was coming and couldn't stop it all but was going to try anyway. And I remember what she told my mother when we reached the river. She said, 'Teach your children that impossible just means no one's tried hard enough yet.' Do you think she was real? Or just a story?" Sarah smiled. "Does it matter? She made real things happen. She freed real people. She gave real hope. If that's not real, what is?" The historian had no answer for that. In 1965, during the Civil Rights Movement, a group of activists held a vigil under the Mercy Oak. They read from Samuel's journals. They sang freedom songs. They talked about the long history of resistance that had brought them to that moment. And as the sun set and the stars came out, several people swore they saw the ground beneath the tree begin to glow softly, as if something old and patient was acknowledging their struggle, their sacrifice, their refusal to accept injustice. Today, the Mercy Oak still stands, though the city has grown up around it. It's in a small park now, protected by historical designation, surrounded by plaques that tell a sanitized version of the story, careful not to offend or challenge too much. But the people who live nearby still talk about the glow, still talk about the feeling they get when they sit beneath those branches, the sense that they're not alone, that they're connected to something larger than themselves, to a history that didn't end but continues, that requires each generation to choose what kind of world they want to build. And sometimes, on quiet nights, you can still hear humming beneath that tree, a wordless melody that sounds like sorrow and hope and defiance, all woven together. A reminder that the girl science couldn't explain changed the world, not because she was more than human, but because she was perfectly, impossibly human in all the ways that mattered. She loved when love was forbidden. She fought when fighting seemed hopeless. She sacrificed everything to make the world slightly better than she'd found it. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. Because some stories aren't about endings. They're about beginnings. They're about planting seeds that grow into forests, lighting fires that spread across generations, asking questions that echo through centuries. Mercy asked a simple question with her life. Will you look away, or will you bear witness? Will you accept the world as it is, or will you burn bright, trying to make it what it should be? Every person who hears her story has to answer that question for themselves. Every generation has to choose whether comfort matters more than conscience, whether convenience matters more than justice. The girl who was born in a root cellar, who glowed in the darkness, who freed hundreds and died at 15, she's still asking that question. Through the tree that marks her grave, through the stories that refuse to die, through the impossible fact that one person with enough courage and enough love and enough willingness to sacrifice can actually change the course of history. She's asking you, right now, across nearly 200 years, what will you choose? What will you risk? How bright will you burn? And the land is listening for your answer, just like it listened to hers, patient and eternal, and waiting to see what impossible things you might make real.